I have composer Derek Bermel here with me, and we are going to talk about Intonations. That is a fairly new album, came out a couple months ago, I believe, on the Noxus label. Um, Derek, thanks for making the time and talking about it with me here on FM 91.
Oh, my pleasure.
Yeah, it's great to finally talk to you in person. Your music has made it down to Bowling Green, and we do a radio show with Bowling Green. And I don't know, have you been there yourself?
I've been on that festival before, yeah, years ago, because I was a student many years ago at Ann Arbor in Michigan, and
Oh
so
yeah,
we used to come down there when they did their big new music festival every year, and a couple times I had compositions on it.
yeah. Were you studying with Bill Bolcom at the time up there at UMich?
Yes, I was.
Yeah, wonderful. So we're going to talk about Intonations. I want to start with that title track because that's the first thing I listened to, and I immediately thought, well, that's a harmonica. It's not a string quartet, right? The way that you do sort of that iconic exhale and inhale, which is about the extent of my harmonica skill right there. I recognized it immediately, though. Tell
Mine
me
too.
about Intonations.
Well, most of my composing starts with one idea. I'll get an idea. Usually it's an impossible idea. So in this case, it was how can we make a string quartet sound like a harmonica? Now, of course, that's an impossible idea because a string quartet will never sound exactly like a harmonica. But it's kind of a proposition that leads you to be able to solve the problem. And I think a lot of creativity is about solving problems. So in this case, harmonica, I started with the basics, as you described, the inhale, the exhale. And on an inhale, you get a certain group of pitches that just arise naturally when you inhale. And on the exhale, you get a whole other group of pitches. And that's what you hear in the first two chords of harmonica. You hear the pitches you get when you exhale and the pitches you get when you inhale. And after that, it's is I think it goes on to create a sort of meta harmonica. So the harmonica starts to expand in, you know, maybe it starts in 3 dimensions and expands into 4 and then 5. And before you know it, you're off into a really odd realm, but it always keeps that same kind of pulse, that rhythm. It's a little bit of like a little janky kind of, rhythm there that's like a really heavy swing that you might hear in the 1920s or even before. Very American sound, I suppose, but evoking that sound of the blues from the Mississippi Delta
Yeah.
and up the Mississippi River.
It's interesting because your music is alternately really ear-catching and thought-provoking, and also just satisfying for the little bits of phrases that you have in there that are kind of catchy, for lack of a better term. I sense some microtonality going on in this movement as well. That's a part of, I think it kind of evokes that different world that you're talking about. In fact, this whole album is kind of like about the metaverse, and we'll talk about some of those other pieces as well. But that's the first movement, harmonica, and you've got two other movements to Intonations, the hymn slash homily, and finally the hustle. And it's sort of like a sonata arrangement, fast, slow, fast. And that last movement really grabbed me because there's almost like an improvisational kind of feel to it. I wonder if you want to talk about the other two movements of Intonations.
Yeah, well, I guess fast, slow, fast has worked okay for like the last 400 or 500 years. So why not stretch it out a little longer? Um, Yeah, the second movement was actually a tribute to one of my other teachers at University of Michigan. We were mentioning Bill Balcom. William Albright was another one of my teachers who actually recorded all of Joplin's rags, uh, marches, and waltzes, and really great musician, great interpreter. He was a great pianist, organist, and harpsichord player. He used to sometimes play all three on one concert, not at the same time. But yeah, this was the whole piece really was inspired by reading The Invisible Man. I reread it a couple years ago as I was writing this piece, and I found these little earworms of phrases that I couldn't lose, and it's just such an imaginative book. Very really conjures a lot of different images about New York through the eyes of this protagonist who's living underground. And so the hymn homily, you know, I think each one of these movements deals with an extended technique in a different way. When we talk about extended technique, just meaning a non-traditional string technique, something you might write for a string instrument that might conjure something else, like we talked about the harmonica. And here, really, the inspiration is the Black church, gospel music. And in the first movement, that harmonica goes a little bit off into a quarter tone universe, like you said, microtones. And in this second movement, the microtones are really used for an expressive purpose. When you hear a gospel singer sing, you can even hear it in pop music. If you listen to somebody like Stevie Wonder, you'll hear, he'll sing, hey, 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 something like that. And that kind of sound, he's actually using microtones. I mean, he may or may not call it that, but he's delving into the space between the chromatic notes on the piano when he's improvising or when he's embellishing. And so a lot of what happens in this movement is that you hear a kind of a plaintive singing melody, first in the viola and then in the cello, then later in the violins. And then they're kind of amplified and supported by the other instruments, just like the organ would support the singer after he's been preaching. All of a sudden it goes into song, and then you're in a new realm. And so you hear these quarter tones, they're like bends in the notes, and they're really for the purpose of expressivity. So I think the idea was almost to encapsulate what you might hear in a church service. And then in the third movement, Hustle, it's really, I guess there's an influence of hip hop. So you have all these different aspects of Black music, from the blues to church music to hip hop, and so therefore, what I was trying to do in Hustle was really to stress the idea of contour over pitch. And by that, what I mean is that you hear the movement of the phrase, but you don't hear individual notes within that movement. So that rather than hearing a melody, you hear the shape of the melody, which is what I would call contour. And I do that through various methods, mostly through glissando, which you hear throughout this piece. Glissando, which is moving across the string smoothly, which is one of the wonderful things about string instruments, because, as human beings, we don't speak on individual pitches. If we did, we would sound like this. No one speaks like that. We speak in a fluidity, and we move, up and down in the range of the voice. And so there's this kind of flow, which you can do on a string instrument, because you can move right across. It's not like a fretted guitar. You can move right across the string and get a smooth kind of glissando, which goes up and down, and that is really what I was trying to do here, was to place the emphasis on the movement up and down, but not on the individual notes like you would find if you were playing a melody.
Yeah. Well, it's so interesting the way that that piece that you're talking about, Intonations, is connected via the musical language that you're talking about, the way that it surfaces in the violin etudes. There's a literal conversation, and the violin sounds like what you were singing, on different notes. Um, Maybe you can talk a little bit about your musical language on this disc, because some of it's all related to each other, right? The violin etudes have that 20 questions it starts out with. I'm curious if you want to share what any of those questions are, if you can translate for us. But the violin really, it sounds like somebody speaking in a language you don't know. You just hear that melody, you hear those tones happening, but you're not quite sure of what the instrument is trying to say to you. Maybe you can shine a little light on that.
Well, I think what you just pointed out, you got at the heart of a lot of what I'm interested in, which is the sound of the human voice and the
Mm,
cadence of the human voice and the way it moves through time and space. And I've always been really interested in language. I love learning languages, and I love even just learning phrases in language. I got a big kick out of trying to learn some words in Mandarin when I was in China playing my clarinet concerto. I learned some phrases that I would repeat back to people because you know you learn so much about a culture by being around the language because you hear the way it's expressed in sound and you
mm,
hear the way they think about gestures um and in the case of in the case of a piece like the violin etudes, like 20 questions, um, you know, I did actually have phrases that I modeled those questions on. But the more important thing is that it's abstract because if you knew the questions, you would be listening to the meaning of the words. But in fact, out of we can get so much meaning out of phrases that where we don't know what the words are just by hearing the intonation, the emotion of what the instruments are doing. So in fact, we get a lot of meaning, and the meaning that I'll get, knowing what those questions were, will be different than the meaning that you get when you don't know what the questions are. You have to invent your own meaning, and part of art is the audience being engaged. Is that I'm not spelling it out for you. You have to actually bring your own self to that listening. And that is one of the most profound things I think about the experience of art, is that it empowers the listener or the viewer or the experiencer to have a place within the art, so that it's not didactic. I'm not telling you what it's about. You have your own interpretation, which is part of the beauty of art and the power of art. Also, it's
yeah.
abstractness.
Yeah, wonderful. So you're not going to translate for us. That's okay.
No, no, because I'll ruin it if I translate. Anyway, then I hem it in. I make it smaller than it is. Instead, you want it to be as big as the imagination of the listener.
Yeah. Um, well, that brings me to we've been talking about violin pieces and string pieces. You also perform your own clarinet work on here, which is also a sort of a dialogue to it. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about, I'm curious because, you're a virtuoso clarinetist and a composer. When you're writing for yourself, how does that work for you? I mean, composers in the past have often worked with, other instrumentalists, or they've been like a pianist or what have you. I mean, what is your process? Is it any different when you write for your instrument as opposed to, say, the string instruments?
That's a great question. For a long time, I didn't write clarinet music exactly because of that, but inevitably I had to start doing some. And what I love more than anything is I love playing with great musicians. So this summer I got to play with some fantastic string quartets, it was just so much fun. I love playing this music and being um, around some musicians from whom I can learn, because those are my teachers now, are my colleagues. Sadly, a number of my teachers have passed away, and now my colleagues are my teachers.
Yeah.
And and my students. Sometimes if I teach, I learn from students too. But but I would say, the clarinet is, its limitations define its beauty in a way, because of course clarinet is more limited than some instruments. I think I became a melody guy because I was playing a melody instrument. I mean, I love playing the piano. Actually, I think I like it more than playing the clarinet, actually. But the piano is a chord instrument. It's a vertical.
Yeah.
The clarinet is a horizontal instrument. It's a melody instrument. It's an instrument, and that's one reason I've always been drawn to counterpoint, which is horizontal as opposed to uh, thinking vertically in chords. I've always thought horizontally in terms of melodic lines intersecting. And so when you're writing a solo clarinet piece, you only really have one line unless you're playing multiphonics, which you can, and sometimes I do. But so that leads you toward a different type of composition. It's like if you were making, have you ever seen those line drawings that a composer will do, that an artist will do when they put the pen down and then they start to draw, and it's only just one line. They're making it all out of a line. And you could do some beautiful things with just a line. But of course, when you write for a solo instrument, it's that kind of feel that you have to create three-dimensional space through this one dimension or two dimensions. So that's the challenge of it. But it also allows you to do things like counterpoint with yourself, which Bach was great at doing. So when I write for a one-line instrument, my model will always be Bach, because Bach was able to do so much with just a very focused kind of approach when he wrote for solo cello or solo violin. And
Yeah.
that's what I tried to do in Thracian sketches. I used my knowledge of the clarinet style. I had been to Bulgaria and studied the Thracian folk style from a wedding musician, wonderful player named Nikola Ilyev. And I wove together something that they probably would never, ever do in Bulgaria. In fact, if they heard it, they probably would think, this is kooky. I don't know what he's doing. He took things and changed them all around. So I changed the meters, I changed the harmony, I changed a lot of the rhythmic cycles. But in any case, I found my own way through those influences into creating a structure which starts very soft and ominous and grows loud and raucous by the
Yeah.
end.
And very colorful too, the way you're able to get kind of a sense of the harmony through your clarinet in the same way that Bach did. He'd play one note and you could hear the entire structure of the piece in that one note. It's a wonderful composition. I want to talk to you about this idea of the metaverse again. You've got a piece on here called A Short History of the Universe, which I'm reading was inspired by lectures, by a physics lecture. Can you tell us about the genesis of this piece?
Yeah, well, I was fortunate enough to have an appointment for 4 years as the artist in residence at the Institute for Advanced Study, which is a mouthful. That is, I guess you could call it a think tank in Princeton, New Jersey, not associated with the university, but rather a totally separate place. Actually, Einstein spent the latter part of his life there, and many of the folks there are scientists and mathematicians. So I was thrilled to be able to get to know them, and to, which wasn't always easy. I mean, I'll tell you, I don't know if you know that joke about mathematicians. It's something like, how can you tell an outgoing mathematician? It's because when they're talking to you, they look at your shoes. I don't know if you get that, but anyway, it shows that, sometimes it can be a little hard to relate, but
Right.
I found it so fascinating to collaborate with some of these scientists, or, even to go to their work as inspiration, because I found a lot of the scientific process to be similar to the artistic process. And by that, I mean that a lot of the way that they think about, how I described earlier, coming up with an idea and then kind of testing it, and seeing, trying to solve a problem, trying to come up with a problem to solve. And in a way, that's what scientists are doing all the time. They create a hypothesis. They say there's this problem exists. How do we solve it? Okay, I'm going to create a hypothesis about how this might be solved. And then I'm going to test that hypothesis and then draw a conclusion. And that's kind of what we do as artists, in a slightly different way. But in this case, I was inspired by lectures that I attended by a theoretical physicist named Nima Arkani-Hamed. And Nima is still at the Institute. He's a Canadian theoretical physicist, particle physicist, mostly works on the CERN, the particle collider in Switzerland.
Yeah.
And so he was giving lectures, but they were kind of, I wouldn't say they were populist lectures, but they were designed to appeal to an audience that was not just a science audience. And he was asking questions like, why is the universe big? Things, just very simple questions like that, and talking about his research. And so I went to a bunch of these because I had been very interested in physics and had studied some physics early on before I kind of became a musician. And I was always interested in physics, and some of my heroes were there at the Institute. So I loved connecting with them, as I did with Nima's work.
Yeah. It strikes me that language is such a unifying concept of this piece, but your sort of interpretation, your reaction, this last piece makes me think on the surface of like the Dante Sonata, or a list after a lecture of Dante, kind of being inspired to create art out of somebody's words or somebody's concepts. Yeah, it's such an interesting thing. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about yourself before we go. Which came first for you? Was it the clarinet or the composing?
Well, it's hard to say because, I started the clarinet when I was about 7. And what I remember was that my first composition that I wrote out, I mean, I used to improvise a lot and sing and things like that. But the first thing I wrote out, I remembered, was an elegy from a guinea pig when I was 11, who had died. My mom said, well, why don't you write a composition in the honor of the guinea pig? So I did. But later on, years later, I uncovered some compositions that I had written even earlier, and they were called like Symphony Number 1, 2, and 3, that I think I had written when I was about 8, and they were for my brother and I to play. He played trumpet and I played clarinet. So yeah, there you go. There was always something creative in the works. But I certainly got the bug about age 11. I had two composers had a huge influence on me. One was Olivier Messiaen, the French composer, and I heard a piano piece that just knocked my socks off, which was called 20 regards sur l'enfant Jésus, which is 20 views of the infant Jesus. Yeah. You must know this piece. Yeah. And it just knocked my socks off. Even being Jewish, I loved it. Almost converted me. And then the second one was that I got my first album of Thelonious Monk, which was It's Monk's Time. So they were both actually piano works. And fortunately, it was right around the time that my grandmother had bought me from a relative of this really junky used piano, which was really not worth any money. In fact, they should have paid her to take it. It was a real clunker, but it was good enough for me to start composing on. And so I'm always grateful that she bought me this instrument, which really kind of got me started writing music and playing music, playing a lot of jazz.
It's interesting that you mentioned Messiaen as well as Thelonious Monk, because they're both profound musicians in their own right. But it also speaks a little bit to that sense of, and this is a word that you hear often, I'm sure, eclecticism in your music. Lots of different influences, but the way that you present them is so interesting, and I really appreciate you taking time to talk about it. Um,
Oh, well, thanks so much. I mean, and just it was such a pleasure to work with the Jack Quartet and V.
yeah.
Clements, on this disc in Adam Abe's house who recorded it. Because, when you work with musicians like that, they make your music even better than it is. So,
Nice. Well, thanks again. The album is called Intonations. That is out on the American Classics series from Naxos. We'll link to that on our website as well. Derek Bermel, the wonderful composer and clarinetist, performer, and writer of the music on this recording. Thanks so much for talking with us about it today here on FM 81.
thanks so much, Brad.